Thank you very much for the kind invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, and I want to say in advance, and it was already mentioned by Professor Tonen, that my talk will be somewhat more on substantive issues. I will focus on Europeanization of public administration in general, and I would like to present you some analytical considerations, suggestions regarding the analysis of such developments, and it's not explicitly concerned with the Europeanization of the study of public administration. However, I think that both topics are closely related and of course should be closely related, and I will, in the concluding part of my talk, will also make these linkages between these two areas more explicit. So it's more or less a well accepted finding that there is a close linkage between the formulation and implementation of European policies on the one hand and the national administrations, national bureaucracies. And I would argue having a good understanding of national administrations is more or less crucial in order to understand European governance and to understand multi-level governance, that is the interlinkage of national and European governance activities. On the one hand, we know that national administrations have a strong hand in the formulation of European policies, and on the other hand, they are, so to speak, the crucial actors in when it comes to putting European policies into practice, that is the implementation stage. And here you have, to some extent, varying empirical findings. Sometimes national administrations are characterized as the bad guys who are unwilling or unable to carry out necessary structural and practical adjustments in order to effectively implement European policies. On the other hand, we have evidence that in some cases administrative arrangements have been transformed massively, fundamentally, in response to European policy developments. That is, overall we have a highly variegated picture, and of course the immediate question is, well, how can we account for this variance? And the classical explanation, or the conventional explanation you find in the literature, is that authors look at characteristics of national institutions, that is, the national administrative configuration. And in this context, also the more or less the so to say the state-of-the-art argument is made about misfit and the degree of fit between national administrative arrangements and European requirements, and that this is the crucial factor in order to account for variance in administrative transformation in response to European policies. Now, I do not want to question with this argumentation today, but I want to provide some analytical configurations, some analytical suggestions which try to explain variance from a somewhat different angle. And in particular, I would argue that the extent to which we can expect administrative transformation, administrative change at the national level, and the extent to which we can expect administrative convergence across member states is not only affected by these national institutional factors, but it's also affected by the specific governance mechanism or governance pattern that is underlying European policy. So it would be wrong to assume that there is kind of unique and uniform pattern of European governance, but if you take a closer look at European policy making, you can identify different patterns. And for this purpose, or in this context, I would like to identify or distinguish between three ideal, typical patterns. And now it's getting difficult. So, namely coercion. Secondly, competition, and thirdly, communication. And my argument is, I want to try to show that according to these different patterns or modes of governance underlying EU policy making, there's a different potential of domestic administrative transformation and also a different potential for cross-national administrative convergence. So in the following I will briefly sketch these three patterns, and in the concluding part I will then provide some insights on what this analysis might tell us for the topic of the study or the Europeanization of the study of public administration. So let me start with the first mode of governance, coercion. What do I mean by this? Coercion means or refers to a pattern of policy making at the European level that is on the one hand legally binding and on the other hand leaves member states' administration little or no discretion when complying or putting European policies into practice. That means that we have a kind of institutional or administrative model that is described or prescribed from the European level to the member states' administrations. And we have that quite often, especially in cases or areas of so-called positive integration, for instance, consumer protection, environmental protection, where European policies imply far-reaching adjustments of national administrative styles, administrative practices, or prescribe the concrete establishment of regulatory agencies, for instance, that is, changes in administrative structures. So that is, you could of course argue that the term coercion is not a very good term insofar as member states normally have to accept these policies at the European level. On the other hand, there are many dynamics of the EU decision-making process which might imply that member states have to accept certain European policies, although these policies are not actually in their very interest. So there are many dynamics which might imply that these kinds of adaptation pressure emerge. So the question is then, what is the reaction, the logic of domestic administrative adjustment? I would argue in this case the logic is persistence driven. That is, normally bureaucracies try to comply with the European policy requirements by minimizing as far as possible any cost of institutional adjustment. That is, the bureaucracies try to comply with the European requirements by using existing administrative practices, incorporating European requirements into existing standard operating procedures, into existing administrative structures. Insofar, and often this comes at the cost of very ineffective implementation. And it is very, or I would argue in this case, it is the bureaucracies are the crucial players when it comes to the implementation of European policies, because the basic discussion in this case is not so much about problem solving. That is, at the national level, there's not so much a discussion if and to what extent a certain European policy will solve existing policy problems, but the discussion is about legal and technical matters of formal and technical compliance with EU requirements. And so, insofar, and this is a typical matter of a bureaucratic discussion, insofar the bureaucracy has a very strong position in that process. And as we know from bureaucratic theories, organization theories, bureaucracies typically stick to their existing structures and practices. And so far, the expectation would be, in that case, administrative transformation in response to European policies is very limited, and from that follows that we can also expect only limited convergence of administrative styles and practices across countries. And this finding or this expectation is confirmed by many empirical studies which investigated the implementation of EU policies at the national level. We find these patterns of, on the one hand, often highly ineffective implementation, which is a result of insufficient institutional adjustment. Now the picture is somewhat different if we come to the second governance pattern, which I would like to refer as competition between national administrative systems. What is the difference between competition and coercion? Also in the competition case, we have, of course, to some extent legally binding rules from the European level. However, these rules leave the member states broad discretion, broad room for compliance, for designing appropriate administrative styles and structures. And this pattern we clearly find, or most prominently find, in fields of so-called negative integration, market liberalizing policies of the European Union. Here, legal prescriptions are restricted to the abolishment of protectionist measures at the national level, or protectionist regulatory arrangements at the national level. However, apart from this, member states are completely free in designing regulatory arrangements to regulate market access and market operation. What kind of logic explains, in this case then, patterns of institutional change? And here I would say the logic is not persistence driven, but it is performance driven. And this emerges, if you like, as a matter of fact of this pattern of competition. You might be familiar with these theories of regulatory competition, which argue that in integrated markets, national regulatory systems are in competition with each other in terms of bringing about the most effective regulatory frameworks, strengthening the competitiveness of national industry, or attracting a high rate of foreign direct investment, and so on. So there is at the center is not so much the interest of the bureaucracy of sticking to existing administrative arrangements and structures, but there is a more politicized discussion about the performance of certain regulatory regimes, especially the performance in comparison to other member states. And this higher degree of politicization can be explained by the fact that, especially in this market competitive fields, the policies might have highly redistributive impacts, not only within member states, between different societal groups, but also across member states. So different tax rates, for instance, might have important repercussions, and you see, for instance, especially in the tax case, to what extent these issues are politicized at the national level. So what we can observe empirically, that in many cases the bureaucracies tried to stick to the existing structures, that is, they try to follow kind of persistence-oriented logic, but in many countries the whole process of implementation became very much politicized, and as a result of high societal mobilization, we often observed very far-reaching institutional changes. I was myself involved in a project where we investigated the liberalization of European transport policy, and we could clearly observe very far-reaching changes in many member states, which reflected a kind of big bang to existing highly regulated institutional structures. And there are many other studies, for instance, on telecommunications policies of the EU, where authors come to similar conclusions. So what we can expect in this case then is that there is a higher potential for administrative change, for regulatory change, and there is also a higher potential for cross-national convergence. Although I would not say that national path dependency will not matter anymore, overall the expectation would be that cross-national variance decreases to a stronger extent, as this is the case with respect to the first pattern of coercive policies. And so far we have a somewhat paradoxical expectation that in policies which are, in this competition case, which are not explicitly directed at institutional harmonization, convergence at the domestic level, we can expect a higher degree of convergence as in the case of coercive policies, where there is from the outset the intention of harmonizing domestic arrangements, and at least from the empirical findings we cannot confirm that this development actually takes place. Now, the picture again looks different if we turn to the final pattern of governance, which I would like to distinguish ideal typically, a pattern of communication and information exchange in transnational networks, this is something which has been developed very much at the level of the OECD and is now more and more diffusing to the European level under the catchword of the so-called open method of coordination. The basic characteristic of this approach is, on the one hand, voluntariness, that is, agreements and objectives are not legally binding to the member states, and on the other hand, the basic intention is the stimulation of cross-national policy transfer and institutional transfer, stimulation of diffusion of best practices. And you could again now ask, to what extent does this affect national administrative structures, and what is again the logic behind this pattern? And in this case, my argument is that we neither have a persistence-driven logic nor a performance-driven logic, but that adjustment or transformation are basically legitimacy-driven. So here, and the reason for this is simply that national actors, when they discuss certain issues at the transnational level, are, if you like, under transnational scrutiny. They are observed by other administrations, and they are at the same time observers of practices in other countries. So, the problem is they get, for national administrations and also policymakers, they get increasing problems to legitimate their own approach if this approach clearly departs from approaches in other countries, from practices in other countries. And this is a very common finding also in diffusion research, that the more countries have adopted a certain practice, the more pressure emerges for those countries that have not yet adopted a certain policy. So far, here the basic logic behind transformation is increasing institutional legitimacy, and this is somewhat different from focusing on institutional performance, because this is not the question of performance. Performance in that case is not so much crucial in these discussions, but it's basically the focus is on so-called best practice, and national actors have to legitimate why they did not adhere to this sort of best practice. So it's to some extent, or at least logically different and analytically different approach compared to the other patterns. Now, also the question here is, to what extent does this pattern of governance imply changes, and to what extent does it imply cross-national convergence? And here the problem is that at least from an empirical perspective, we do not have sufficient findings yet in order to come up with broad evidence and very strong conclusions about this. But at least from the theoretical perspective, I would argue that the potential for corresponding changes is at least higher as it can be expected for the coercive pattern, and the same holds true accordingly for the extent or the degree of cross-national policy and administrative convergence. And there are many studies on policy diffusion, policy transfer, for instance, which are not, of course, not directly related to OMC at the European level, but nevertheless there is some evidence which supports this assumption. So overall, the argument is depending on the concrete mechanism, the concrete logic of governance at the EU level, one might have a different potential for administrative adjustment and also for administrative convergence across member states. Now, what does all this now, how can all this be linked to the topic of this Europeanization of the study of public administration? And in this context, I want to conclude with two arguments. On the one hand, I think that issues of Europeanization so far are not systematically included in programs, MA programs on public administration, yet there is still a basic focus on national developments or even subnational developments, as it is the case, for instance, in Germany to some extent. And this, of course, implies several problems. In particular, civil servants or also students do not know maybe about the mechanisms which drive change and transformation of the administrations for which they are working. And I think that would be a very important precondition for a good educational program, that students have a basic idea, a basic understanding of these processes. Now, the second point I want to make is the question: how can this be changed? And I think one can, to some extent, rely on the arguments I've presented here, because a change in a MA, BA program or overall changes in study programs is nothing else than kind of institutional change or institutional transformation. The question is, how can we bring this about most effectively? And of course, so I think the coercive pattern would not be very appropriate. The EU has tried for a long time to harmonize national education, and I think it was not a very successful process and a very incremental and piecemeal process. On the other hand, I also don't think, I'm not convinced that competition would be the most useful way to go for, because we still have a situation where national universities, national BA, MA programs do not compete at an EU-wide level. So there is nothing such as a EU-wide competition for students yet. Maybe it will emerge in the future, but I think that would also be not the most appropriate way to go. So there remains the final the point, communication, information exchange in transnational networks, and that is something that is actually going on, and this conference is more or less part of this development. And I think that this is the crucial point one should strengthen and continue. And I think in addition to this, what would be important, what is often emphasized in the context of this OMC method, it would be very important to have a kind of reference model or best practice model that would mean a concrete BA, MA program, public administration. There, these matters, Europeanization issues, have been integrated very systematically, and this what could serve as a kind of reference model for other programs. So that, in my view, would be a recommendation one should maybe further look at. So my basic conclusion would be, with respect to the Europeanization of study of public administration, that on the one hand, the very, in my view, very successful, very helpful work on transnational information exchange, communication, establishing of networks should be continued and strengthened, and on the other hand, that it might be useful maybe to have a kind of pilot project regarding a very systematic attempt to integrate a European dimension into the study of public administration. Thank you very much.